and taking some notes. So I'm Stephanie Dahlke with the University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be trying to keep us on time here and guiding you through kind of a little bit of information about the topic, and then hopefully getting a lot of input from everyone about what they think the county could be doing to advance this topic. And then we've got Deb, who's a co-facilitator, and I think we've got, did we have someone from the county? No. I'm unsure if we've got someone who's a member of the Climate Commission on our list. We tried to make sure that they are represented in all the meetings. Either way, at the end, we'll post some links in the chat for ways for everyone to continue to be involved in the climate action plan process and in other respects. So they are seeking members of a resident expert advisory committee. So we encourage you to get involved that way if you'd like to be more involved. Okay.
Stephanie, do you currently see my screen?
I do. I see the slides. You could minimize that top bar if you wanted to, although it's not too bad.
Nope. There we go.
There we go. Perfect. Great. Okay. So you can go to the next slide, Deb. So this topic, we've kind of billed it as being about resilience hubs, but we also wanted to talk about heat island identification and mapping. So these are kind of the two pieces of a puzzle that they complement each other very well. So the county's commission has been, it's come to the top of its priorities that it needs to do heat mapping to identify areas in the county that are hotter than others. And so this is becoming a pretty common practice in cities, since heat, especially in the summer, is a very big public safety risk, especially for people who are elderly or have health issues or who work outdoors. So one of the actions they've identified, we'll talk about more later, is finding out the hottest areas. And then the other side of that is making sure that there are facilities available in the hottest areas that are not just a cooling center, but also provide constant electricity. So they will talk about how they can have battery storage or other ways to maintain electricity during a power outage, which really is kind of makes a heat event or an extreme cold weather event that much worse, is when the power goes out. So resilience hubs is kind of a new fun concept, and it looks at ways to just enhance an existing community facility that everyone uses and goes to and knows about, and providing it with these additional features that help make sure that that neighborhood is more resilient in the event of a power outage or bad weather event. They aren't necessarily emergency shelters, but they could be. Beyond sort of that emergency power outage and power generation capability, they could be kind of whatever the community wants them to be. So there's some really interesting examples starting to pop up around the country. With some of the very first ones have been in Baltimore, and now there's one in Montgomery County. And the great thing is that it's very flexible and it can be what the community needs it to be. So next slide. So some of the benefits of taking this kind of pair of actions together to identify the hottest parts of the county and then trying to locate these hubs within these hottest parts of the county to make sure they're within walking distance for community members and vulnerable folks, is that, hubs often end up with solar panels. And so that's a great way to reduce air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And then they've got the battery storage to help the local neighborhood in the event of an outage, so that if people have, refrigerated medication or other kind of basic medical needs, they might be able to get help there. And then they can also serve as a cooling and heating center if there is a power outage. And that helps directly prevent deaths due to the extreme weather. And the other side of this, once the neighborhoods that are hotter in the county have been identified, then the county can couple that with some of these other actions in the climate plan to, increase the tree canopy in those areas, because that'll help not only with just the suffering due to heat, but also with people's energy costs, because you'll reduce the overall temperature in that neighborhood. And you can also focus other interventions on these hotspots once they've been identified. So next slide. So just a couple of things that the county's been up to already. They've got some initiatives such as energy resiliency zones that are trying to target areas that perhaps have are overly burdened due to a variety of challenges, and then try to get more, microgrids, try to make that neighborhood more resilient in case of power outages. And then that also helps with their energy costs and things like that. And then another thing that we've been seeing a lot more of, for example, in the county is, putting solar panels on town buildings, county buildings, and then also installing green roofs, which are a great way to help cool an area, especially if you've got a pretty large development or a big box store, things like that. It's a great opportunity to try to address cooling at the same time. Next slide. So I mentioned before that, there are already some resilience hubs in existence, and some of those are just up the road in Baltimore. And also at the same time, the state agencies have been supporting more grants that are aimed at kind of bridging this gap between needing energy independence for a place to help protect the neighborhood and the vulnerable populations if there's an outage, and then also reducing greenhouse gas emissions and other things. And so the state's been putting some nice grants into some of these facilities so they can couple not only solar panels, but then the storage, the storage of the solar power overnight, and then it's there. And then they can also send that power back to the grid if they're not using it. And so that's a good cost savings for that facility as well. Next slide. All right, so the two main actions that we're going to talk about here and get your input on, because of course our main goal here is to hear from you all what your ideas are, what your concerns are, and do you think you have specific suggestions for how the county can actually put these actions in place? So the first one is to identify heat island hotspots, and there's kind of a map here of what they've done for the District of Columbia. So you can see that there's blue and orange and red, and it's identifying, of course, you can see Rock Creek Park is that nice blue cool swath, and then some of the areas in the northeast quadrants in the center of the city are some of the hottest. And then that helps the city go in and target their interventions. And so the plan would be for the county to identify these hotspots they use satellite imagery and other mapping technology, and then that's where you locate your resilience hubs, as in the hottest areas. And so the second action here that we want to talk about is how to establish these resilience hubs, especially in facilities that the county owns and has control over, or other kind of community buildings that folks know about and they like. So we can talk about some of those ideas here going forward. Next slide. Okay, so we'll take a breath here for a minute, and we want you all to think about, well, what could this program look like if the county is going to map hot spots and then try to go and invest in these resilience hubs in some of the hotter areas? What could it look like? Who's involved? What needs to happen? What could happen? And where should these things happen? And how? And then on what time frame? And we're especially thinking of just in the next few years, how do we really make some of these things happen in the short term? So I'll stop talking just for a minute here and let you think, and then we'll get some ideas here. And I will remind everyone to use the chat box if you'd like to type up your ideas in the chat. And also you're welcome to raise your hand, and then we'll make sure we try to give you a minute to share your ideas or your questions. I'm going to double check our time before we get going. Okay, so has everyone had a chance to think? So I see there's a couple of hands up. Sherry, are you did I pronounce that correctly?
It's Kari.
Kari, sorry.
It's okay. Hi. So I'm actually a rising sophomore, and in my biogeochem class, we talked a lot about like grants and ways that we could get more people involved. And so I think the biggest thing is just like allowing the funding for it, because a lot of these businesses and community owned buildings don't necessarily have the funding to do these resilience hubs on their own. So I think that if we make it like a priority of ours to get the funding needed to even like zone out hotspots, that would help a lot.
Great point. Thank you, Kari.
Thank you.
Okay, Herb, you have your hand raised?
Yes, very quickly, very interesting, and I do concur with the resilience hub. And my two quick questions: the overlay that you talked about that they have in District of Columbia that show where they are, what would be the timeline in your mind for that here? Okay, and that's the first one. Then just very quickly, and my second would be, I think the resilience of the utility becomes just as important in this discussion. I know in the district, they have a committee on resiliency, and the utility company is on there to making sure that the utility is resilient to floods, to weather events, et cetera, et cetera. And I just wanted to put that out there as not so much a starting point, but I think the utility company has to become more resilient. And then we move on to the resilient hubs, which make a whole lot of sense to me. Thank you.
Great,
Stephanie, can I ask a clarifying question on the timeline question? Herbert, are you asking the timeline for creating those maps, or the basis of the time for the heat? We do project that the county will be experiencing increasing numbers of high heat days, as well as increasing times where those days are, multi-day events, where you have a number of days. So are you asking about the time?
And I apologize not being clear. I meant just what would be the timeline to do that overlay to get a sense of where those hot spots are in the county?
Gotcha. I think the question is what do folks think it should be?
Okay.
As a consulting team that we created the maps for DC, the work itself doesn't take a long time.
Okay.
But whether that's a top priority and folks think that should happen this year, or whether that's a lesser priority and it happens a few years from now, I think is something we're really looking to hear from folks about.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Imani, I see you raising your hand there.
Yeah, just to kind of respond to the previous speaker's comments about when. It's interesting because when I saw, it's a couple of years ago, I believe, the heat map for DC, and because I can literally, even though I can't walk very fast, I can walk to the DC line where there is a serious heat island or whatever they call it, right on the south side of our neighborhood, because we're at the northeast DC, right on the other side of Michigan Park. Okay. And I found that quite eye-opening. And I think that it is important, if you're going to get people interested and excited about doing something, those maps are very, very, very important. And to get that part done, map them as quickly as possible. And then people will understand that, oh, wow, that's my neighborhood. Oh, that's just 2 blocks away. And this is why we're also very concerned in my neighborhood about trying to get the county agencies to protect our trees, because they're neglecting the trees. The trees are what's saving us somewhat. But as the trees die off because of invasive species and neglect by the county, then we're going to be fully in the center of that heat island as well. So we need to know, everyone needs to know where they are, and so they can get motivated to do something.
Great point. Yeah, get the mapping out of the way, and then the county and all of the residents can take action based on the results of the mapping. Okay, so I want to move on to the next slide. We want to talk a little bit, hear from you what you think that the main challenges are about trying to implement these actions, and what you think the big opportunities are. So we can take a few minutes to kind of talk about how do you think this will affect your community, and what are you worried about in terms of trying to implement, say, the resilience hubs. The mapping is kind of a more straightforward activity. Obviously, a lot of other actions will tie into it later on. But I think especially in terms of the resilience hubs, what are the challenges and opportunities? Or do you have ideas about where you think they should be located, or how do we make sure the people that need them the most will be able to access them in a time of need?
Yeah, I guess I have one question about once you determine, okay, this is where heat is an issue, what are the other vulnerabilities that you guys will be targeting? If it's different things related to social economic issues, or in the other discussion and flooding, somebody mentioned about disabilities. How will the county go about looking at, okay, you have heat, excessive heat in an area, but then how do you address some of the other vulnerabilities that you have, and really communicating not only that to that group if they have limited ability to internet and some other ways of communication. I'm sorry, that's my kids in the background.
No worries.
But and then the other thing in terms of opportunities, I'm at Morgan State University and we're in Baltimore, but we have a number of students who are residents of Prince George's County who would love to participate in seeing how they can engage the county and engage the public, and also make this part of their research. So we have some capabilities. We're also now connected with a NOAA research center that's dealing with climate. And so we'll have some capabilities and then some other expertise that we can bring to the table from some other experts.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll share these links a little later about the opportunities for additional participation, but I think we'll also flag that, so the county is sure to know that you and your students could be a great resource and partner.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. And so, Deb, I don't know if you want to address the mapping piece, since you all have been involved in that kind of heat mapping before, but I know that a lot of these efforts, especially around climate adaptation planning, they kind of look at all the existing vulnerabilities within their population, and then you look at the different layers of risk that those different vulnerable populations are likely to experience with climate change. So, current flooding and future flooding, and then, current heat island issues that will only get worse if we don't address them. But I don't know if that gets integrated in the heat mapping process, Deb.
Yeah, I'll maybe take it in two different directions. As part of the current work to develop the climate action plan, we did produce a climate risk and vulnerability assessment that is more related to the specific climate hazards, and it will hopefully be released sometime this summer up on the website with the other materials related to the climate action plan. So it goes through the best available data related to flooding risk, winter storms, temperature, drought, basically the flooding both from storms as well as rivers, which are actually kind of two separate issues, because you are now getting flooding from microbursts that don't have to do with rivers overrunning their banks. So there will be that assessment available. It's not new data or new modeling. It's really just bringing together the best of what's already available in the region, which is actually a pretty, you have a lot of data already in the region. On heat mapping, you're right, Stephanie. So typically we would work with the community to really think about what those economic and equity indicators are, whether that's about communities with a high percentage of immigrants or non-English speakers, obviously income, education, and other factors that are kind of typical to identify vulnerable populations overlaid with heat, stress, and vulnerability. So what exactly your maps would include would get decided, in that process. But right, when we look at heat mapping, we aren't just looking at temperature, we are overlaying that with appropriate demographics to try to understand who's really vulnerable. It is also like housing type and the trying to make some assumptions about who probably has access to air conditioning and things like that. Age, obviously looking for older populations are more vulnerable to heat stress. And then sometimes we're looking at things like workers and other kind of groups that have high exposure to heat. So there's no one size fits all for heat maps. And this is an emerging area. We're seeing more and more cities creating these maps. But those are some of the things that would be included to try to understand the extent of the problem.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for helping explain that, Deb. Kari, do you have a question?
No, I wanted to say that to her point, with the areas that have like a lot of people, I like the high trafficked areas, I think that would be a really big deal because you could assess like what communities the people may be a part of. Because I personally, I'm a teenager, I'm a young adult, but I have asthma, and so that contributes to what I can and can't do in certain heat conditions. So I think that if we account for the conditions that like high trafficked areas have, then we can begin to see like resilience hubs that are truly going to be put to use in all areas.
Great, thanks. Yeah, kind of going along with that theme, what do you all think about the best ways to try to decide where to put these, aside from where it's hottest? What other factors do you think are important to find the best location to install resilience hubs?
Go ahead. Just to respond to that, so the good place to find or locate the resilience hubs, the hubs itself would have to be, in my view, self-sustaining, have their own backup generator. Maybe in my particular community, I'm thinking about Harmony Hall. That's used for a lot of things, that has the capacity to maybe facilitate hundreds of people. But I think backup generators, maybe some solar capacity would be a requirement to any hub, as we move forward.
Great. Zelda, did you have something?
Yeah, well, I had put in the chat that I live in a large condo community, and there are 4 different entities in that community. There are a lot of seniors in this community, and a couple of us had mentioned an interest in having solar panels installed because it would save on utilities a lot. And we were told that the solar companies will only do private homes. And I don't know if that's true, number one. And I don't know if there is a means of doing a larger project, but the less drain on the power grid from Pepco seems like the more there is for other people in other areas. So I don't can you comment on the legalities of that or the feasibility of doing a larger project? Because there are a lot of seniors here that we have a lot of brownouts, and it's frustrating.
Definitely.
Deb,
did you have? Yeah.
It's certainly legal. I think what you might be hearing is that installers specialize in single family homes or specialize in easy kind of commercial buildings. Anything that has mixed ownership or is always harder from a business model perspective, but we are seeing a lot of emerging solutions particularly I think California is out in front trying to figure out how to do multifamily housing and condominiums and how to overcome the challenges about ownership.
If I can just make a comment, if I could, to is it Zelda? Zelda's point, I think, goes to the importance of focusing on the utilities resiliency. She talked about utilities having a lot of brownouts. So the extent that we can make sure they're resilient, maybe using some of the infrastructure funds, as well as using those funds for the hub, can really help us, because that just exacerbates the issue of resiliency when the utility company itself doesn't have the resiliency it needs. So we can at least limit or minimize the brownouts that Zelda talked about.
Zelda, are you seeing brownouts associated with storms or not? Nope, you're still muted.
Zelda, can you unmute?
Yeah, she's still on mute.
Or you can chat me an answer, but I would.
Okay,
there we go.
I got it.
There you go.
We did, no, they're not always related to storms. They're very rarely related to storms. Although we did have one that knocked us out for 2 or 3 days, not that long ago. We did have some equipment failures that were very time consuming and very expensive, but of course it happens in the worst possible time. But we historically have so many brownouts that I threw away my alarm clock that plugged into the wall, because one time I had to reset it 5 times in one night. And I was just like, okay, we're going to batteries. And I replaced every single light bulb with LEDs. I mean, there's just such a poor electrical system here. This place was built in the 60s. But who knows what the cause is? It's not always something real that we can really put our fingers on. So
Yeah, but that's a good point. Is the part of the idea not only behind a resilience hub, but trying to get a lot more solar in the county, is that helps buildings become more independent from these larger disruptions on the grid. And then you can also work on improving energy efficiency within the building at the same time. That's a win-win for everybody. When you start saving money and you don't have brownouts or blackouts. Okay, I want to do a time check. I think we've got about 5 more minutes left. We do have one more slide for our discussion purposes, I think. Yep. So there we go. Thank you, Deb. So we wanted to talk a little bit about sort of thinking about, obviously, the mapping part, identifying hotspots in the county will help really show us kind of who's currently being impacted by heat. And so if we put the right things in those areas, then those people should benefit, and hopefully they'll not be subjected to undue heat problems in the future. But who might be left out by either implementing a resilience hubs in some places but not others, or the way we implement them? Are there people who won't be able to take advantage of a resilience hub? How can we make sure that this happens in an equitable way so that the people who need it most can use them?
Well, just off, if I may, Herb Jones, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking seniors and maybe folks in the handicap community in terms of logistics, getting from point A to point B to the resilient hub. If there's not a plan of action directed at them in terms of the community engagement component, they would definitely, I think, be left behind. If I understand the scenario of the resilient hub.
Right, they need to get to the hub in order to take advantage of it.
Right.
Great point. Any other thoughts? Well, we can get we can get into some nitty gritty here just for the last couple of minutes of our session. I think the next slide is just kind of how do we think this could work within the next 3 to 5 years? What needs to happen for the county to implement these actions? So we already talked about how they should get the mapping out of the way, so they know where the hotspots are, and then they can tie all the other actions to resolving those hotspots. But what else? What else needs to happen? We talked about, Herb just mentioned, if we don't have the right kind of outreach and engagement to people that have mobility issues, they won't be able to take advantage of a resilience hub. But what else do we need to resolve?
You know what, I'm going to say funding, the money, that portion. That's why my reoccurring theme during this call has been this infrastructure money from the federal government may not happen again in the next 10, 15 years. So we have to make sure our county leaders are focused on the appropriate allocation to do these things that we're talking about. That is critical, because we won't come by this way again in terms of these infrastructure dollars that will allow us to do a lot of these strategic things we talked about, because it's always going to come down at the end of the day, okay, what does the budget look like for all of this?
Great point. Yep. And I think Kari mentioned earlier that a lot of these community facilities, they don't have the money to invest in a solar panel and a solar battery storage system. So having that kind of grant program and making it not contingent on the group needing to front the money,
right,
is probably also important. Any other thoughts? How can the county do this? Imani?
Well, I think that no one has mentioned so far the role of the Maryland National Park and Planning Commission, because heretofore they have operated quote unquote cooling centers, for example, and they move around here and there, and usually, and a lot of people don't even, if they can get to them and they're not walkable, number one, then they say, well, my God, these hard folding chairs that they set up are so uncomfortable. I mean, me, for example, I can't sit in a hard chair for more than about 15 minutes. That's it. So they say, I'm not going. I'm just going to stay home and take my chances. So it's more than just a place with cool air. There are other, what I think would be very helpful is to find a quote unquote model, really good model somewhere in the country, video it, bring it local, and say, this is what a really great one could look like and should look like. Okay. And then maybe sell the model and get the Park and Planning Commission on board, because they seem to have money for stuff. And when we say the county, a lot of times they're not thought of as part of it, but they are. And I haven't heard anybody today mention the role that they play in all this, even protecting the forests, the trees, all of that. On their property, they're some of the worst management people as far as forests and trees. I'm sorry to say, because it's happening in our neighborhood all the time.
Yep, great point. They are one of the bigger land managers and landowners in the county. And if they have a cooling center, but it's an awful experience, who's going to want to go? So yeah, how can we make them inviting to everyone who needs them? Does anyone else have any thoughts or concerns? I think we're going to get whisked back into the main session momentarily. What else does the county need to do in the next couple of years to make sure this gets rolling?
Just very quickly, there may be need for some very direct legislative initiatives from the county, from the executive, the county exec, to really push this and make it a priority. Some legislative initiatives.
Yep, good point. Yeah, and unfortunately, Dawn's not in here. She's definitely been working on that from the county side. So I know I'm pretty sure they think it's a pretty high priority, even without the climate action plan. But she could say more. Okay, I'm going to pop a link into the chat. I've been doing some research on some issues in Philadelphia, and they've got a cool example, a case study. They did a neighborhood heat initiative and developed kind of a plan for that neighborhood, and also a whole kit they've come up with. So if you're really interested in this topic, I suggest checking it out.
I think this may be simplistic, but I think we also have to continue to build strong communities and make sure that people know what's going on in their community. It's not always easy. Even people that have resources to come to Zoom meetings for our community are still not coming, but you know, that getting people to start looking after one another is really critical, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, it's not very tangible, but it's really important.
Yes.
Yeah, and I can say from the climate adaptation world, it's the communities that are closer knit and where everybody knows each other. Those are the ones that are able to bounce back after a disaster. And they check on their neighbors when the power's out, things like that. Okay. Well, I'm still waiting for us to run out of time, and we haven't yet. Is there anything else on these topics that folks would like to share? Concerns, questions?
I'll ask. One of the questions that comes up is when these maps are made available, how to make them more publicly available? How to is it putting maps up online? Is it interactive? Is it putting them at the library, or what helps get maps out to folks who need to make decisions about the information? Because creating the maps is not the hard part. Any examples that you've seen from some other mapping exercise or something that's really helped connect people? Yeah, Amani?
Well, no, I don't remember where I saw how I got into the DC maps one time for whatever reason it was. But I mean, I would say all of the above. You have to do everything because not everybody is online, you know, TV, to community groups, directly. I mean, we have different organizations and agencies in the county now, the Community Relations Agency and all sorts of things. I mean, it's just a massive, just do everything possible all the time on a regular basis.
Okay. All right, so we've got about 45 seconds left. Anyone got anything else short so we don't get cut off mid-sentence? And I just posted these links in the chat. They're also on this slide here. The county definitely wants to engage residents, so you can join this kind of resident committee. And there's a website where you can sign up to learn more and get involved in meetings. And there's this virtual open house where I think the recordings from this session will be posted. And there are other opportunities to provide feedback as well. Thank you, everyone, for spending the time tonight. I think this has been really good.
Agree.
All right.